Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar, which is focused on sharing some of the key takeaways and some case studies related to the California Adaptation Forum's track number 2 on integrated planning for holistic solutions. My name is Julia Kim. I'm the Climate Change and Energy Program Director, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I think we're going to continue to see folks trickling in. So we do have quite the packed agenda. So I'm actually going to get us started so we save as much time as we can for the case study presentations and Q&A. I wanted to first thank all of our sponsors for making this year's CAF series possible, particularly to our champion level sponsor, Southern California Edison. Really appreciate all of our sponsors for your generous support. And again, without your support, this series wouldn't be possible. So a lot of gratitude. We also want to thank all of our promotional partners for helping us extend our reach, spread the word, and bring new voices and perspectives into the CAF community. As many of you may know, the 2021 California Adaptation Forum focused on the Grand Adaptation Challenge. We explored key challenges faced by California's adaptation community and opportunities both equitably and creatively. So you can see the 3 tracks that we organized, and today we'll be sharing some key takeaways and case studies from CAF's second track on integrated planning for holistic solutions. This was a team effort to pull together. So before we dive straight in, I do want to take a moment to recognize our track facilitators, Whitney Brennan, Peggy Nguyen, and Rima Chakra. 3 of you have been so critical to pull it. And yeah, thinking so creatively and working collaboratively to design the workshops and create interactive experiences for participants, and even helping to shape both the introduction and kickoff webinars. So I want to thank you for all your hard work and commitment that you put into the CAF series. I also want to thank our partners over at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Juliette Finzi-Hart and Nikki Caravelli, as well as the CAF planning team here at LGC, Kelsey Wolf-Cloud and John Vandervoort. It took this entire team to pull the series together. So huge thanks to everyone involved, and thanks to all the participants joining us today, making the time to participate. So just in terms of what we covered as part of this track, our kickoff webinar explored the cascading and compounding nature of climate change impacts, which necessitate an integrated cross-sector approach to adaptation planning. Then at our first workshop, we explored 5 key challenge areas related to integrated planning: insufficient resources, competing priorities, siloed sectors, ineffective governance. Those were the 4 key challenge areas. And then participants identified specific barriers, promising practices, and case studies. For our second workshop, we focused on inclusive community engagement frameworks and case studies, and participants engaged in a scenario-based exercise to create community engagement strategies and to do a rapid design of outreach materials. And then lastly, for our third workshop, we dove into regional planning and collaboration. Participants shared success stories, tools and resources to support regional collaboration, and we engaged in a set of discussions to explore some of the big elephants in the room related to regional planning collaboration. How do we define regions? What is the ideal role for regional collaboratives? Who should be leading regional planning efforts? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to advancing regional priorities? So I wanted to share just a handful of key takeaways that emerged throughout this workshop series. First being that limited funding and staff capacity are the most significant and commonly experienced barriers to integrated planning. So this includes limited capacity to coordinate across siloed sectors, translate science into action, monitor and evaluate adaptation projects, and more. Participants also discussed the need to expand and train the climate workforce, including succession planning to manage staff turnover. Some folks also discussed how building awareness and political will through public engagement, public education, and leadership development could help to elevate climate change as a priority and increase funding for adaptation efforts. We also heard calls for decision support tools and guidance that are a bit more concrete and actionable. Another key takeaway, institutional changes may be needed to enable integrated planning across sectors and jurisdictions. So we heard from some local agencies that they're constrained by more narrowly defined agency missions, and some sector-specific agencies have legal restrictions that make it challenging to fund multi-sector planning and implementation efforts. And oftentimes the siloed nature of agencies and organizations can create internal competition for resources, further constraining the limited funding that is available. We discussed how new valuation systems might be needed to ensure adaptation investments lead to equitable outcomes for our most marginalized communities. The prioritization of adaptation investments based on more traditional economic valuation systems, so looking at the economic value of infrastructure and property, including potential losses, can further divert resources from under-resourced and historically marginalized communities. So we heard from some participants that they're working to add environmental justice and climate resilience requirements directly in project approval and design processes. Participants also discussed how additional research and tracking systems, such as tracking the impacts of climate change on public health, could help to produce the data that would be needed to then create more equitable, people-centered metrics. Another key takeaway is that community engagement is foundational to adaptation planning, and it must be authentic, inclusive, and purposeful. The communities need to be involved in adaptation planning in order to produce actionable plans that meet community needs, empower action and collaboration, and build public support for climate resilient solutions. Planning processes should be designed and centered around community engagement, and adaptation plans should reflect the community needs and priorities that planners are hearing. So we discussed the importance of being honest from the start in terms of how much influence communities will have on the plan, rather than just gathering input that may not get considered in a meaningful way. And every encounter is an opportunity to build trust, and as planners, it's important that we do our homework, we show up authentically and with respect, and also follow through. Participants shared a number of strategies for inclusive and authentic community engagement, like meeting people where they are. We've heard that quite a bit, right? So going to barbecues and soccer games, and attending existing community meetings, partnering with trusted community-based organizations, and spending time in the community to understand their makeup, who their leaders are, what their concerns are, and what their aspirations are. We also discussed the importance of working with local community-based organizations and tribes to craft culturally competent language for outreach. Another item folks discussed is the importance of being prepared for creative conflict rather than designing agendas to avoid conflict, just being prepared to foster a kind of dialogue. Finally, the main takeaway, a rather broad one, is adaptation planning needs to be adaptive itself. That's the biggest theme that seemed to emerge throughout all of the workshops, just the need to right-size our planning approach to meet the challenge at hand. And the challenge we face is complex, it's interconnected, it's uncertain, cascading and compounding, just thinking about how complex climate change is. And then to further add to that complexity, our sectors are siloed, community needs are diverse and constantly evolving, new policies and mandates are being adopted each year, and staff and leadership changes can also be challenging to navigate. With that said, the broader adaptation field is also in a constant state of evolution as new research tools, funding, pilots, and resources come online. And while adaptation planning is incredibly complex, we heard many examples of how adaptation practitioners are rising to this challenge. And something that we took away from the workshops is how important ongoing collaboration will be to both our individual and collective efforts to develop integrated, actionable, community-informed plans. So with that, I actually wanted to open it up to hear from some of our track facilitators to see if there are additional reflections that folks might want to share. Rima, maybe I can pass it over to you first.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I absolutely agree. We have a lot cut out for us to get through this adaptation effort, and we all recognize how challenging it is. But like Julia was saying, we do see a lot of stellar examples of communities throughout California tackling this issue and tackling it in a way that is cross-departmental, cross-disciplinary. And we heard from some awesome speakers, which I was so honored to hear from, including Watsonville and their approach to developing multiple plans at the same time and working across departments and dealing with sometimes conflicting grant requirements. But we also heard from Los Angeles County and their vulnerability assessment, looking very closely on critical infrastructure or lifelines and how climate change could affect the system, and identifying strategies to address what happens when one system gets disrupted and its cascading effect on others. We also heard from Santa Cruz on their push to really elevate voices from the community and try to hear from folks that are not typically part of planning processes. That was really great. And we were also inspired by Michelle's talk about the Movement Strategy Center, about the spectrum of community engagements. And most of the community workshops acknowledged we're kind of in the middle. There's a lot more to aspire to in terms of affecting municipal change and working with the community. We heard from Sonoma County on their multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan, which looked at pulling in a lot of city agencies, member agencies in the county to really set themselves up for funding from FEMA and look at collaborative solutions. So it was really fantastic to hear from the different guest speakers and how they are attempting to tackle this challenge, and inspiring. And I also really thank all the workshop attendees for sharing their experiences and thoughts and input in such a candid way and from their own experiences. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I thank LGC and OPR for this chance to facilitate.
Thanks so much, Rima. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, you guys did a great job with the takeaways. One thing that really stuck out for me was, even from the first workshop and talking to the attendees, there seemed to be a big shift, everyone really trying to think about how they can do adaptation planning at more of a community scale or regional scale, and how they can work with a wide variety of partners. There just seemed to be a lot of interest. There's still a lot of challenges where people aren't sure how do we get it done, but there's a lot of hope there. And so I just found it heartening that there's been a shift, and there is a lot of focus of people working at that community and regional scale more. And we saw that with our speakers as well. Thanks.
Thank you both. I know Peggy's in transit, but if anyone has had the opportunity to work with Peggy, she's such a rich source of information and resources. So yeah, huge thanks again to all of our track facilitators for making this series possible and quite fun, I should say. For today's webinar, we'll be sharing a few case studies and then opening it up for audience Q&A. So before we jump in, I did want to invite everyone joining us today, all of our participants, to introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat. We'd love to hear from you who's here with us. Our first presentation will be on local hazard mitigation plans and safety elements, how Marin County is coordinating across plans and jurisdictions. Leslie Lacco earned both a BS in a bachelor's in conservation and resource studies and a master's in environmental science policy and management from UC Berkeley. Before coming to Marin County, she worked for the State Coastal Conservancy, the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and she was a watershed management consultant for the Alameda Resource Conservation District. She has worked on innovative climate change adaptation projects for over 10 years and continues this work with Marin's Community Development Agency. Thank you so much, Leslie, for joining us today. After Leslie, we'll hear from Corey Bidoff on General Plan to Adaptation. Corey is a Sustainability Program Manager for the City of San Rafael. He co-authored and is responsible for implementing the city's Climate Action Plan, which is now being used as a model by other cities in Marin. Corey also oversees a volunteer program and approaches sustainability from an interdisciplinary lens with a focus on community and collaboration. Thank you, Corey, for joining us today. Our third case study presentation will be on a changing climate, vulnerability in California's Eastern Sierra by John Wentworth. John is the chairman and CEO of the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access Foundation, and is also a member of the town council of the town of Mammoth Lakes, having served as the town's mayor from 2017 to 2018. In a prior life, John worked in the motion picture industry, where his credits include co-producer of Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, and Mulholland Drive, directed by David Lynch. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today. We're about Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy from Amanda Hansen. So Amanda joined the California Natural Resources Agency in April 2019 as the Natural Resources Agency's Deputy Secretary for Climate Change. In this role, she drives the agency's efforts to build California's resilience to climate impacts and accelerate the contribution of nature-based solutions to meeting our ambitious climate goals. Amanda previously worked on climate issues for the Governor of New York, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and the U.S. Department of State. She earned a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University. So thank you so much, Amanda, and to all of our speakers for joining us today. Super quick, wanted to go over some logistics before we pass it over to our first speaker. So for Q&A, we encourage all to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A module. You also have the option to upvote questions that you already see in the module if you're particularly interested in hearing a response to us. We also encourage you to continue using the chat function to introduce yourself, kind of engage with your peers, share your reflections as you hear the presentations, and share any resources that you're aware of that folks might be interested in. If you're encountering any technical issues or have questions about the California Adaptation Forum, please feel free to reach out to John Vandervoort or Kelsey Wolfcloud. And without further ado, Leslie, I'll pass the baton to you for the first presentation.
Okay, so thank you, Julia. I'm working on the safety element update for Marin County, and I'm also working with a group of other people on the local hazard mitigation plan update for Marin County. So what is a local hazard mitigation plan and what is a safety element? I know it's a pretty basic place to start, but I want to make sure that everyone understands. A local hazard mitigation plan, or LHMP, is a plan to assess local vulnerabilities to environmental hazards and then identify projects that reduce those vulnerabilities. Those projects then qualify for FEMA funding. And another part of an LHMP that is encouraged but not required is to plan for climate change adaptation. Now, the safety element is a required part of the general plan, and it includes an assessment of local vulnerabilities to environmental hazards also. From there, the safety element identifies goals, objectives, and policies, and then implementation measures to carry out those policies. And I'm not sure why that just did that. And for the safety element, looking at climate change adaptation and resilience is a requirement. Now, when I first started this project, I made this big spreadsheet to compare how the safety element and the LHMP were similar and different. And what I found was that they are so substantially similar in the area where they are assessing the vulnerabilities that you can essentially use that for both plans, which is sort of what we're doing moving forward with both of the updates. And then where you get to the next phase here, you're really looking at something that's more specific to FEMA funding in the LHMP and something and policies that are more related to planning. However, we still want to make sure that we have a lot of overlap so that our goals and objectives that we set are reflected not only in our policies, but also in the projects that are identified in the LHMP. In Marin County, we lucked out. there were several pieces of legislation that tied the timeline of the safety element update to the housing element update, which occurs every 8 years, and several pieces of legislation that tied the safety element update to the local hazard mitigation plan. For Marin County, both of those, the LHMP and the housing element, are coming due at the beginning of 2023. The housing element is part of the general plan, like the safety element. It's also housed within the Community Development Agency, which is where I work, which is where long-range planning is at Marin County. So in many respects, it makes the most sense for us to move forward with the housing element. And so that's what we decided to do. We have a consultant who's working on both the housing and the safety element with us. I'm leading the safety element, and a person from housing is leading the housing element update. But we're doing all of our public outreach together. And where we can incorporate the local hazard mitigation plan, we're also doing that. At the same time, the local hazard mitigation plan is housed in the Office of Emergency Services and the Department of Public Works, but also the Community Development Agency. We have a planning grant from FEMA, a hazard mitigation planning grant that we administer within the Community Development Agency. But we work with the Department of Public Works, who will be the agency that will carry out most of the projects that get identified in our Lhmp, and with the Office of Emergency Services, who really were the brainchild behind our Lhmp as it now sits, which I'll get to in a second. So I covered some of the differences. The Lhmp is on a 5-year update cycle. The housing element is the 8-year update cycle, which the safety element is also triggered by that as well. In the Lhmp, mitigation is pretty narrowly defined, but in the safety element, the policies can be much broader, so they can reach a little further, perhaps. The climate change adaptation is optional in the Lhmp. It's required in the safety element. And then we have, within the Marin County, I described the different departments that administer both. But also at the state level, the Lhmp is administered by the Office of Emergency Planning, or Emergency Services, I forget what they're called. And then the safety element is administered by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So so that's also 2 different agencies to navigate as well. So sorry, I think I'm a little heavy-handed on my buttons here. In Marin County, when we updated our Lhmp in 2018, we decided we would do a multi-jurisdictional Lhmp, which we call the Marin County Multi-Jurisdictional Lhmp, or the MCM Lhmp. So our Lhmp identifies the vulnerabilities and risks county-wide, and it includes all of our cities and towns, as well as one special district. The way that it's laid out is that the vulnerability assessment is laid out, and there's a discussion of the risks, and then the projects are identified by each jurisdiction in separate appendices, and then the governing body adopts the Lhmp. So that's how we ended up laying it out. The effort to get everyone on board was pretty substantial, but that's already done for us at this point. When they did do the Lhmp update in 2018, our LHMP was so out of date at the time that they really just scrapped it and did a full rewrite of the LHMP and a full really assessment of the vulnerabilities. So the information that we have in our current LHMP, even though we're updating it, is very relevant, very current, and really so useful for the safety element. So we have a lot to work with. We've also done 2 sea level rise vulnerability assessments, one for our bay shoreline and one for our coastline. So we have a lot of information that we can use for our safety element update, and we are coordinating in that way. Now, a couple special things about the safety element is that with SB 379, we're required to do the climate change adaptation and resiliency planning. And we will include that in our LHMP as well. There was a separate law that also requires us to look at wildfire safety, which of course is part of resiliency planning, but there's also a requirement for CAL FIRE to review that section of the safety element, which is why I include it here as a separate item. And then we also have to identify areas that don't have adequate evacuation routes. That's not typically something that's in an LHMP, but it will be in the safety element. So our process for the safety element is that we're doing the vulnerability assessment now. We're really relying on a lot of information that's already in the LHMP, and then we've got new data and information that we're using for the climate change adaptation part of the safety element, and that will also be included in the LHMP. Then we'll set our goals and objectives, and those goals and objectives will also be goals and objectives that we will share with the LHMP process, so that when we're identifying policies for the safety element, we're also identifying projects for the LHMP that are consistent with our goals and objectives. So the goals and objectives should really be agency-wide. And then for the safety element, we have to also include feasible implementation measures. Now, one of the ways that we're coordinating through the LHMP process is we have an interdepartmental working group. So that group includes the Department of Public Works, the Office of Emergency Services. Because it's a housing and safety element update, we also have Health and Human Services, and we also have our legal counsel involved. And then we also have county parks involved. They have a lot of nature-based adaptation projects that they work on, and they own a lot of property in Marin, so it's important to have them involved too. But we're coordinating across all of these departments, and then we coordinate additionally through the LHMP process with our multiple jurisdictions. So we have a monthly interdepartmental meeting and a quarterly multi-jurisdictional meeting for the LHMP. So it's quite a bit of meeting and a lot of coordination, and we're hoping that it'll work out that we have LHMP and safety elements in full alignment. And in that process, I also wanted to say that our vulnerability assessment will be available to the public in mid-November. So we have a meeting scheduled, a public meeting on November 15th, where we will present that to the public. So that's where we're at now, and that's about all I have for you at this point. I'd love to come back at some time in the future and let you know how it all works out. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm going to quickly pass it over to Corey, a city within Marin County's jurisdiction, to share a bit more about about their planning efforts and how that's intersecting with Marin County's own multi-jurisdictional planning efforts. So Corey, I'll pass it right over to you.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. Share my screen. Pop that out. Well, hi everybody. So yeah, I'm Corey Bidoff. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager for the City of San Rafael. My main job is to implement our Climate Action Plan. The City of San Rafael is the largest city in Marin County, but Marin County is very small, and we're pretty small ourselves. We're about 60,000 people or a little less. And I'm not necessarily the general plan expert for the city, but nobody was really available to do it. And I am sort of spearheading the adaptation planning right now for the city as well. So adaptation planning in San Rafael is really informed by some of the key things that we've been learning throughout the CAF, which is we don't have subject matter experts at a lot of our smaller cities. We don't have a lot of resources in general. So we rely on the county. We like to partner with the county. And one of the things that we did was we put a lot of time into our general plan and developing the safety element and other elements to make sure that we captured a lot of the things that we wanted to do for our eventual adaptation planning in the general plan. And it recognizes that we need all of our community involved and having buy-in if we're going to do adaptation planning well. Oops, sorry, I gotta click it first and then move. Okay. So our general plan 2040 was completed. It was completed this August, and you can find it at cityofsanrafael.org/general-plan-40. All the elements are there, all the past meetings and all kinds of stuff is there, so you can find it all there. It acknowledges, though, and incorporates existing programs and collaborations. That was one of the important things. There's so much going on that it wasn't like we had to start from scratch with the safety element as well. We have things in there, other studies and reports, such as the sea level rise technical guidance study that we did. We referenced the county's vulnerability assessments. There's our 2018 wildfire protection action plan, which we'd already done, and the like. It also leverages some of the great work the county has done related to adaptation guidance for general plans, which is really nice. And as I said, it can be found on our website if you'd like to take a look at it. One of the things that it did serve to do was to commit to adaptation planning. And so climate adaptation is a guiding principle that is integrated throughout the plan. It informs more than just the safety element, land use, of course, but mobility, natural environment, equity. And also our general plan includes our climate action plan as well by reference and integrated throughout. So there's a nice synergy between the two. Our general plan does adopt the local hazard mitigation plan by reference, but also weaves recommendations and policies into the policies and programs in the general plan. And as Leslie mentioned, this multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan has the countywide vulnerability assessment, but also has specific programs and policies related to each individual city. So we have our own annex, which has all of the city's programs in there as well. So the safety element, it's a safety and resilience element. What I like about that is there was a real acknowledgement that often when we talk adaptation planning, we're talking about structures and things and geography, and it really takes into account the human element as well, and recognizing that we need to have good relationships. We need to rely on people, networks, communities, institutions for resilience when in the face of disaster as well. So there are other things in there. Our big two areas, of course, sea level rise, flooding, and wildfire have received a lot of attention in there, but also other climate related issues as well as non-climate related issues. And I think one of the things as we were talking about coordinating countywide and really doing this planning internally at the city was that it made no sense to really isolate climate impacts from other natural and non-natural impacts, and that the local hazard mitigation plan is an ideal place to kind of capture all that. So there are things in there, like we have a sea level rise overlay now. There's scoping for a future adaptation plan and committing to develop one, which we're now seeking funds for. It prioritizes community collaboration. There's stuff around real estate, land use, of course. And then the downtown precise plan also has a strong focus on adaptation planning and recognizing how vulnerable San Rafael is, especially to sea level rise and wildfire. And then we are hoping to do a local neighborhood specific plan as well, which would do the same. And then related again to the local hazard mitigation plan, we have these other structures. One of the things that we had to kind of make a decision on in the last year was whether or not we wanted to move forward countywide with some major new bureaucracy that dealt with tying together all climate impacts, whether it's mitigation, adaptation. There was a recommendation by the grand jury to move forward that way. What we opted to do was not create a new bureaucracy, but instead to try to find ways to tie together existing things. Like we have the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, which is a 17-member JPA that all works together based on a parcel tax for 10 years to really mitigate fire risk. It's fantastic and it's going really well. So it didn't make any sense to create new things. We have Drawdown Marin, which is looking at adaptation and mitigation at the same time. We have these great vulnerability assessments that have already been done. So instead, we kind of landed more on the approach of tying together and finding ways to work together. And this local hazard mitigation plan process is an already established way to do that. Not saying that we wouldn't change things as we go down the line, but it really made sense to kind of beef that up and strengthen it, as Leslie was mentioning. And then the last thing I'll mention is just that from the general plan, how are we going to begin adaptation planning again with this idea that we don't have the subject matter expertise or the staffing in-house right now, but we'd like to build that up, and that's a priority for us coming up. And so it's really about that whole idea. Years ago, I was in a workshop where they said, most agencies sprinkle on equity rather than baking it in. And that's just stuck in my brain ever since. So our whole approach is to power share, to bake in equity at the outset, not think about it as a community engagement strategy, but think about community engagement as a strategy for power sharing. And to fund our community partners rather than saying, oh, we'd like you to help us with engagement and connecting with the community. And by the way, here's $10,000 or $20,000. It's like, well, why don't we find the funding to make sure that these organizations that are working with us and are sort of our liaisons to the community are funded adequately to have subject matter experts at the agency to work with us in a collaborative fashion. And then the idea of building capacity. As we were developing this with a couple of our nonprofits, they said, we often talk about coming and building capacity in the neighborhoods, but there's a capacity element that needs to happen at city government as well. You need some cultural competency. You need to know how to work with communities of color. And so we've built that into our structure as well. And then, of course, building a cross-departmental team, like Leslie mentioned, is we really need to do that here too. We're woefully behind in a lot of that stuff, but I feel like the general plan has really launched just in that direction, and our council really understands it now, as does the community, with all the community engagement we've done so far. And then, of course, collaborate community countywide. We rely on Leslie and her staff. They're just fantastic, and we couldn't do this without the county. And so we have this commitment to work on moving from assessment to adaptation together as we move forward. And then, of course, partnering regionally as well. So I'll leave it at that and send it back over to you. And it's just a small city that's trying to make do with what we got. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Corey. It was great to hear how both Marin County and the city of San Rafael are approaching planning. Great to see the local to regional connection there. We're going to continue on this trend and focus next on a regional effort. So John, I'll throw the baton right over to you.
Sorry, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Great to hear what's happening on the coast, the Bay Area. We're going to take a step east, and we're going to step maybe back out a little bit from counties and towns and start talking about cross-jurisdictional collaboration in a very large landscape. First, I'm just going to share our land acknowledgement for this region, which is quite vast, quite complex. Public lands in the United States hold the creation stories, burial grounds, and ceremonies of indigenous people who were killed or forcibly removed from their ancestral homes during territorial acquisition. Many tribes comprised of different bands lived in the Eastern Sierra region, caring for their native lands as they coexist with the ongoing impacts of colonization. Past or present tribes and bands associated with the region that this effort is aware of, but are not limited to the Miwok, the Mono Lake Kazetica, the Mono Manash, the Numu Paiute, the Newe Shoshone, the Timbisha, Utu Guatu Paiute, and the Washo. Two Numu terms describe the region and provide important context of ideas offered in this presentation. The first is Pamido Twayabi, the Western Mountains, and the other more widely known place name is Payanado, the place where water flows. This acknowledgement is an invitation to all organizations, residents, and visitors to recognize the way this history has shaped the present as all parties work together in anticipation of a better future. And forgive me if I've not handled any tribal names correctly, but this is a land acknowledgement that we share as part of all the work we're doing over here in the Eastern Sierra. So the project I'm going to share with you today comes out of a partnership. And this is necessary when you're dealing with landscapes that involve a lot of federal agencies. And this partnership is the Eastern Sierra Sustainable Recreation Partnership. You can see a bunch of logos down there at the bottom. These are the members that are involved with this. And this partnership has recently been supported by something called the Sustainable Recreation and Tourism Initiative, which is a funded effort that the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and Prop 68, which funded the effort and the planning process I'm going to describe to you now. So this is the Eastern Sierra, and this is the study area of the project that was undertaken over here in this region. It involves 3 counties, 2 national forests, 5 units of the National Park Service, Caltrans, BLM, Department of Water Power. It's about 17,000 square miles. And of this, well over 98% of this landscape is federal public lands. A very small proportion of this is actually land that's under the jurisdiction of the state of California, i.e. counties and incorporated towns. But when we're talking about nature-based solutions, this is what these landscapes look like. Rural California is typically configured in this kind of a way. This is a more detailed view of the study area. You can see the towns, the various jurisdictional layout of the region. And the partnership, as you saw, involves a lot of all these public agencies. So this is an effort to really bring all these folks together and figure out how we can really take a look at what climate change, resilience, and adaptation is going to look like in these vast landscapes. The partnership has produced a prospectus for future investments in the recreation and tourism economy, which is the economy that we have out here. This is important because we have been anticipating money coming out of the federal government. Certainly the Great American Outdoors Act was approved by Congress along with the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund, which has important implications for parks in Marin County and across the state, but also the very important resources that the state of California has made available to all of us. I believe there's about $15 billion in the state right now that's going to be deployed across the state. We'll see what the feds come up with, but it's always great to be part of the team that's leading the way on this in this space. In this case, it's the state of California. So a little background on this initiative funded by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. Was awarded in 2019. As mentioned, it came through the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and Prop 68. It was awarded to the town of Mammoth Lakes on behalf of the regional partners. We have a COG out here just in the last year or so has established itself as a joint powers authority. So there's issues around capacity. Certainly rural California is a very big challenge. Work got started on this in 2019. There are 4 tracks in this initiative, and today I'm going to focus in on the climate resilience and adaptation track. But the point of this whole project was to develop a series of projects. With them would move on for funding opportunities with a lot of the money that's coming out of the state and the federal government. We're in the final stages of that. We'll be wrapping this up by probably mid-December. And one of the projects we've already applied for some funding for comes out of the climate adaptation and resilience assessment. And that fits in with the prospectus as part of the 8 portfolio of the final projects that are being produced through this effort. And as I mentioned, we're in the final stages of this. A lot of grant writing going on. It's a very exciting time. So this is the changing the climate adaptation resilience assessment, a changing climate vulnerability in California's Eastern Sierra. I'll put some links in the chat here in a little bit. You can take a look at the document yourself and pour through the executive summary and all the various appendices and part of it. The study was primarily undertaken by a group called PlaceWorks, which you all may be familiar with, one of the leading climate consultants in the state of California. And you can see that's the study area of what we were looking at. But in addition, just doing a climate adaptation and resilience and assessment, a big part of what's in the study is a natural capital assessment to really get a sense of when we talk about nature-based solutions, what is the value, the monetary value, not the extractive value, but the monetary value of the ecosystem services that come out of a region like this. I'll give you some details of what we found. It's pretty interesting to understand the value of these natural resources and the potential for the state to start looking at these as assets on budget sheets. How can we invest in these things for their long-term sustainability? As I mentioned, PlaceWorks very well-known set of consultants in the state of California. They were involved in the California Adaptation Planning Guide in 2020. I believe they were the lead consultant for that. So I'm going to share now, these are some slides that PlaceWorks actually produced with MLTPA, which is the nonprofit foundation that I run. We developed this presentation together, and we shared with a lot of stakeholders here in the region, here in the Eastern Sierra. And you can see when you start working in these rural landscapes, it's very important to have on the ground knowledge and intelligence. I think as Corey was talking about how important it is to really bring all sectors of a project in and have everybody at the table to make these things effective. We did with this. And obviously we started with looking at the climate threat and how the climate is really having enormous threats to rural places like the Eastern Sierra, to Tahoe, obviously up in Plumas County with the wildfires. We've all seen these this summer. These are very, very real things out here, as they are for everybody throughout the state. But these changing conditions are threatening numerous aspects of the Eastern Sierra region, including the recreation and tourism industry, which is the bedrock for the economy out here. And these local impacts affect everything from property damage, destruction, to all to the infrastructure, the things that make this recreation and tourism economy possible. Again, as I mentioned, it's mostly primarily federal public land, so a lot of it is not owned or managed by towns or counties, but we all work together as partners in this landscape. We share a landscape with each other, with the American public, who are the owners and managers of these things. But it's very important to be taking all these things very seriously. And the goals of the project, as we went into this, were to identify the climate change vulnerabilities, and understand the benefits of the regional ecosystem, as I mentioned, and consider some projects and some next steps for how we can, in this landscape and this nature-heavy place, what are things that we can do to improve and advance regional resilience? Obviously, this has been informed. We've all been watching very carefully the great and very progressive and forward-looking work of the state of California, the expanding nature-based solutions team. This is moving very quickly. It's happening very fast. I'm sure you've all seen the opportunities to comment on the state's latest adaptation planning documents and the nature-based solutions documents. We're digesting these things as much as we can. It's a lot to deal with, but it's very important stuff. And we're looking at, in this document, the key vulnerabilities in California's Eastern Sierra, and really looking to identify what the risks are, what are the impacts going to be to the local economy, and looking at the risks at separate management units, because again, we're dealing with federal partners, state partners, local jurisdictions. It's a real hodgepodge of things. And the project area, as I mentioned, spanned a wide variety of jurisdictions and partners. You can see them all listed here: National Park Service units, LEDWP, California State Parks. This is the nature, again, of the configuration of lands in rural California. And it's so exciting to see the state wanting to really engage every square inch of the state of California as part of the solution package for climate change. And that's certainly representative in the area where we live and we work. These are the individual project proponents. For Leslie and Corey, sort of everybody else, the components of what goes into planning these things is not being prescribed by general plan authorities coming out of the state of California. It's really about best practices and how can we come up with a plan and a document that's going to be useful to the jurisdictions and the people here, and to chart the future path for this region as we move forward, adapting and making ourselves resilient to climate change and adapting to it as it happens. There was a very detailed, very specific vulnerability assessment. If you dig into the document and some of the appendices in the later pages, very detailed scale and assessment of the various levels of vulnerability of the various things that were analyzed. 136 different populations were looked at. 10 different distinct hazards were identified. And all these things were put into a very detailed and very thorough vulnerability assessment itself. And to do this kind of work, you have to be drawing from a lot of different sources that are not necessarily from the state of California. A lot of federal studies were involved. We've talked, I don't know if we've talked today, but I think we're all talking a lot about regions and how the state is going to identify and configure regions. When you're dealing with the federal government, you're dealing with different regions of the U.S. Forest Service, Region 4, Region 5, and others. So it gets pretty complex and pretty complicated. A lot of the work that MLTPA did on the ground was to aggregate, bring all these various resource documents into one place so that the consultant team could really have the best data to work at. And obviously look at the primary activities that happen in this region that drive our economy, that are good for people's souls. I hope many of you have been over, had a chance to visit over in the Eastern Sierra. If you haven't, I hope you come soon. It's good for you. We're about to get 3 feet of snow this weekend, so that's exciting. But these are the things that human beings do on these landscapes. And this has enormous and important social and public health benefits for human beings, for all of us to be on these landscapes. And these are the activities that were the lens through which climate change, adaptation, and resilience was analyzed and was measured. And obviously, hopefully coming out of the process are some key regional findings. Really looking at the health risks to tribal communities and other frontline groups, their other frontline exposure to these types of risks. Analyzing the economic harm of the tourism and recreation industry. It may be harm, it may be just a question of what it's going to cost to adapt and prove ourselves to be resilient. Opportunities for widespread recreation disruption. The ski area here in the Eastern Sierra starts at about 8,000 feet. Base elevation goes about to 11,000 feet. Tahoe is much lower. This may be the last ski area in the state. How is this going to affect all these things moving forward? These are going to be very important things to be looking at. And then looking at this natural capital assessment, which is, I think, a little bit unique to the effort that we did over here with a firm called ICF. They're out of Washington, D.C., I believe. Looking at all the various resources, the ecosystem services that the Eastern Sierra provides. And the Eastern Sierra, as you hope you're probably all aware, it's a high desert landscape, a lot of sagebrush, a lot of rocks, mountains, forests, but it's not the same as say Tahoe or Modoc County or up north, which are deep forests like up in Shasta County. This is a high desert region, but it still produces an enormous amount of ecosystem benefits from the resources that we have here. And the assessment really proved all this stuff out. So a very careful inventory of these ecosystem services was conducted, and then they were monetized. And I want to make sure we understand this is not for their extractive value. This is not, gee, if we dig all this stuff up or chop all this stuff down, how much is it worth? It's really about monetizing these nature-based solutions in their natural condition. So we're talking about carbon sequestration, water primarily. What are the ecosystem benefits and values of these things? And this is valuable. It goes into planning and budgeting and things like that. It's very helpful to have these types of estimates of these resources available. And what these folks came up with is the range of what these services are. It's about between, say, 44 and 190 billion dollars a year in ecosystem services come out of our region. If you average it out, it's about $95 billion a year. And this is primarily from carbon storage and water resources. The desert shrubland and coniferous forests provide the largest benefits. A quick aside, in Louisiana, when they were dealing with the after effects of Hurricane Katrina, some economists went down there and analyzed the value of the natural resources that could have protected New Orleans from the storm surge. And they realized that it was about a $750 billion asset, the natural resources were. And the question to the state of Louisiana was, well, do you have that asset as a natural asset on your books? And if you don't, why not? And you should probably get it on your books. They said, yeah, that's a good idea. We should probably do that. Well, how much are we investing on an annual basis to maintain those natural assets for sustainability for the long term? These are the kinds of things I think we all need to be thinking about. How do we take these natural assets and incorporate into the state ledger, into the resources we need, because they're going to be critical assets as we all move forward with mitigating and adapting to climate change. So here's a nice graph that kind of lays out the values of these natural capital assessments, the results on how they were calculated. You can see carbon storage is about 40 billion, water quality about 38 billion. The recreation and tourism industry is only about 2 billion. You look at this in the scale of things. These natural assets are things I think are the most valuable to us in California and frankly to the citizens of the United States and citizens around the world. So that's a very interesting way to look at these things. Here's a breakdown: wetland, shrubland, conifer forest, desert shrub. And the monetized value, again, not for their extractive value, but in their inherent value and the role that they play in climate change and mitigation and adaptation of these resources. And it looked at the climate inventory and looked at the potential loss of ecosystem services based on projected climate change effects and how is all that going to work. And we looked at the value of the threat that the climate change poses to the economy and the natural resources here. That it's between what 20 and 115 billion dollars in annual ecosystem services is at risk from climate change and the impacts of climate change. 75% of ski resort revenue is at risk as a result of snowpack losses. So in a region such as ours, these are very real challenges and things have to be taken very seriously, and we have to factor this into how we're going to be adapting to all this. And wildfire obviously is top of mind after the last 2 years that we've all been through. Last year, this region was threatened by the Creek Fire, and the town of Mammoth Lakes dodged a bullet with that. But you saw what happened with the Caldar Fire and what's happened with the Dixie Fire up north. This is very, very serious stuff and has to be taken very seriously, and it poses enormous risks to the ecosystem services and the local economies and how these things actually function. So the consultant team looked at a variety of project ideas for recreation enhancements in the region, and they looked at through the lens of climate change, which is part of the deliverables for the Sustainable Recreation Tourism Initiative. They created some scoring criteria that looked at all the projects. This leads back to that prospectus I talked about in the beginning. How will we value and prioritize investments that may be able to be made on the federal landscape and local jurisdictions as we all move forward? And it was very valuable to have the scoring criteria and to look at each one of these different project ideas. As mentioned, these project ideas were developed by local stakeholders and regional participants. And how do we evaluate these things in a matrix to identify projects and things going forward? What things do we really need to harden the region, our communities for resilience, and to deal with this major adaptive effort that's going to be necessary to work with climate change as it comes forward. And look at all the ingredients in these projects to really understand, are they going to increase resilience? Are they going to harden the landscape? Are they going to be part of an adaptive schema and program? And then will it be eligible for things like FEMA mitigation funds and things like that, financing opportunities that can make all this stuff work. And at the end of the day, the team produced a series of recommended actions. And we reviewed all these things in light of what future efforts might look like. And 5 specific project categories were identified for next steps for things that the region, as with all the regional partners, can do to implement, to move all this stuff forward. Again, there is no single jurisdiction here. We're talking federal agencies, local agencies, counties, towns, but having a kind of a consensus agreement on what the things are we all have to do together to move forward, to transcend the jurisdictional boundaries, sectors, and jurisdictions to move forward. And they've identified the climate funding ready projects that are already sort of taking climate change into consideration for funding and move these things forward. To focus on a climate asset and asset inventory of all the hard infrastructure in the region. Again, a vast landscape, not a whole lot of hard infrastructure, but the infrastructure that exists. How do we do an inventory of all that stuff to move these things forward? Do a gap assessment of what is in the inventory for what's needed for adaptation and resilience. Roll all this up into a region-wide infrastructure master plan to identify where all these things are, where the gaps are, what is going to be needed to adapt and to harden and become resilient to all this stuff. And then really to invest in recreation, education, outreach programs. The base population here is about 30,000 people, and the visitor population ranges between 4, 5, 7 million people a year. So there's a huge asymmetrical disparity between the base population that are California jurisdictions and the millions of people that come here to visit every year. It's an enormous opportunity to be engaging the public with forests, what forests of the 21st century might look like, and what nature-based solutions for climate change look like in practice. It's going to require a lot of cross-jurisdictional work and a lot of common goals and goodwill between the various agencies doing all this stuff. So this is, these are the conclusions, the next steps. I just touched on the actions to come out of this. And so as the final steps that we're in with the Sustainable Recreation and Tourism Initiative, we are proceeding with funding applications to try to move some of these things forward. And you can see the one on the left here, the regional asset inventory. I don't want to say it's a dirty little secret, but a lot of the GIS inventories of all the hard infrastructure assets of the forests and the jurisdictions in this region are 40 years out of date, 50 years out of date. A lot of them have never been field verified. A lot of them were digitized from USGS quad maps 40, 50 years ago. So as we start looking at the reality of adapting infrastructure to the realities of climate change, no one knows where everything is. So one of the recommendations from the assessment was to do an inventory of where, or to redo the inventory of where all the hard recreation assets are in the region, and to try to make this available to the federal agencies and the local partners so we can all understand where everything is, we can identify where the gaps are, and we can move this thing forward. And I'm sure you're all aware of the California Resilience Challenge. I'm sure you probably all have grant applications into them as well, but we put an application in that was submitted back on September 13th to do this update of all the recreation assets on the hard infrastructure of the region. And that's it. Thank you very much, Julia. I'll put some links in the chat on all these different projects.
Great, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. And on the theme of national versus land, is actually a perfect transition over to our final speaker, Amanda. If you're ready to share more about the state's natural versus land climate smart strategy, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to join the discussion today. And we'll walk through a couple of sort of the key elements of a new climate strategy that the state has recently released, focused exclusively on the role of our lands in supporting our climate actions. And to be clear, you know, we've talked a lot in the past about how California can utilize our lands to support our goals related to greenhouse gas emissions and carbon neutrality, and that's still very much a really important element of the work in this space. But the climate smart land strategy is dedicated not just to thinking about and sort of accelerating action that will support carbon neutrality, but also thinking about how our lands and nature in California support climate resilience, both the resilience of natural systems, but also our social, economic, and physical community resilience in the face of climate impacts. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I'm really terrible at this, so everyone just hold on a sec. We'll see how it goes. All right. I hope everyone can see that.
Great, Amanda, if you want to flip it right into presentation mode, you should be able to click that to the show tab at the top.
I'm trying to click on slideshow. It's not working. How do I get into presentation mode? Sorry, everyone.
There's no worries. There's another option at the very bottom toolbar. You'll see the icon on the right. If you go all the way down to the PowerPoint,
down here,
the little icon. Yep, that's that right one. Yep, that's the one. Oops.
Okay.
That's right. Oops.
Nope.
Yep. One right over to the right of that one. Oh, there we go.
Okay. We'll stick with this. Thank you, Julia. Not tech savvy over here. So I will take a few minutes here just to walk all of you through this strategy. And I'm really excited if anyone has questions or reflections, I'd love to hear it during the Q&A session. So as I mentioned, we just released a new climate strategy, a sort of sectoral based strategy. And it was called for in an executive order that the governor issued last fall. We sort of colloquially refer to it as the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order. Really, it outlined a number of different deliverables that various state agencies were called on to drive on, but one of them was this strategy. Really, California, how is it that we are going to develop, how are we going to incorporate this sector into our long-term approach to addressing climate change? So this strategy is really designed to be that sort of vision for how we will continue this work into the future. So really quick, what are nature-based climate solutions? We describe these as actions that work with and enhance nature to help address societal challenges. So as an example, prescribed agricultural fire, restoring wetlands or riparian areas, greening our communities, utilizing practices in our agricultural efforts that increase the richness and diversity of our soils. These are all examples of nature-based climate solutions. They support the resilience of the natural systems themselves, and then they also increase our sort of our community resilience as well. The the strategy identifies a suite of natural and working lands. And I'll just say, you know, our natural and working lands are really, it's sort of the term that we use in California to describe the nature-based solutions sector. And we decided that we really needed to think through how do we define these natural and working lands in California? And the reason that this was a question is because there are so many different, within each of these 8, there are probably, I don't even know, there's just a ton of different, more sort of niche landscape types that add up to our forests, that add up to shrubland and chaparral, that add up to our grasslands. And we really needed to outline or define the landscapes in such a way that would, on the climate mitigation side and on carbon neutrality side, help us roll up the emissions that we're accounting for in this sector in a way that aligns with international greenhouse gas emission accounting standards. So that's how we ended up with these 8 landscapes. And as you can see, California, there's 105 million acres in California, and our natural and working lands make up over 90% of those 105 million acres. So it's a lot to work with here. The overarching goals of the strategy, I won't read this whole slide, but really, we've got a lot of different sectoral efforts within this sector. So we've got our wildfire and resilience, wildfire and forest resilience action plan. We've got our water resilience portfolio. We've got our Ocean Protection Council strategic plan. This is really an attempt to bring a lot of the work that's already underway into a cohesive strategy and then identify opportunities to improve our approach over time. We wanted to raise awareness of this sector. It's growing in its in how much the US and the international community is thinking about how we can use nature. So really wanted to use this as an opportunity to raise awareness in California. We want this strategy to guide action. We need action now. And so we've really made an attempt to identify what actions we think are really important for people to implement. And we've attempted to do that in a way that will be, the actions aren't so prescriptive that people should be able to implement them in a way that is locally or regionally appropriate. But I'll get to this at the end. We look forward to your feedback on whether we got that quite right. We want this strategy really to have a clear nexus with, in addition to driving on our climate agenda, driving on our agenda to create equity and opportunity for everyone in California. Lastly, we really want this strategy to inform some of the efforts that are taking place within the context of the scoping plan. So we want this strategy to inform both our big picture plan to reduce our emissions and to hit carbon neutrality, as well as our big picture strategy for how California is increasing our climate resilience in the state adaptation plan. So the structure of this plan, I just threw this up here just to give people a sense of sort of, what's the what in this plan. We've got this introduction where I think if this is a sector that is new to you, it's a great opportunity to understand what are natural working lands, what is the nexus between our economy or with equity. These are laid out in the introduction, really kind of setting the scene. The second section just summarizes the work that the state has underway in this space. There's also an appendix which lists like all of the different policies, programs, et cetera, that the state is driving on in the sector. Section 3 is where we outline the climate action potential for each of the 8 landscapes. And we also list a suite of climate smart land management strategies, actions that will deliver climate benefits on those landscapes. And I think this is a place where we'd really welcome feedback from people to ensure that we got this right. We welcome feedback on the whole thing, but want to just flag that I think this is an important section. Section 4 one of the things that we've realized about this sector is we don't have a place where we can understand sort of what is happening across California in this space. So really just sort of setting out some preliminary ideas about how we can track our progress and measure our success in this space. Section 5 is a suite of snapshots that we have included in the strategy itself, reflecting what we heard in some of the in all of the regional workshops that we conducted in order to build out this strategy. And then the last section is a suite of opportunities that we heard both in the regional workshops. We also had a couple of topical workshops that informed the development of the strategy, in conversations with stakeholders, people who wrote us letters, really tried to build in what we heard to identify opportunities to scale action on our lands that many of us can undertake. I just want to sort of explain, this is a diagram that I hope helps folks understand, how do those other plans relate to the Natural and Working Lands Plan versus the state adaptation strategy. So this slide is really intended to show that we have a number of sort of sector specific plans that have fed into the development of the Climate Smart Land Strategy, which will feed into the state adaptation strategy and the scoping plan. I think I walked through quite a bit of this when I walked through the table of contents here, but I'll just leave it up to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think I got it all. Yeah, and that's it. So I'm really excited to get public input on this strategy. It's the first time that California has released a statewide look at this sector and how it can support both our resilience and our mitigation goals in California. So I think the public comment period is 30 days and it opened last Monday, so another 3 weeks. And I'll put in the chat sort of just where you can access it and get more information. So I think I'll stop there, Julia, and hand it back over to you. Thanks to everyone again.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. I'm going to just quickly move us along here as we're going to run out of time here, but wanted to invite all of our panelists back into our virtual room, and we have some questions from the audience. I would love to see if folks have any guidance or examples that they might be able to share. So the question here, beyond planning, how are your agencies working to implement institutional changes to integrate climate resilience into your operations? So for example, for project design and approval, permitting, or capital improvement planning processes.
I'm not with an agency, so I won't speak to that one.
Julia, can you repeat the question? I was typing into the chat where the link is, and I am not good at multitasking. So please repeat it, and I'd be happy to answer.
Of course. This is asking, kind of going beyond the planning process, beyond developing a plan, what efforts are being taken to embed climate resilience as part of like an agency operations?
Well, this is a perfect segue for me to, I'm sure that this came up yesterday, but the state just released a draft of our climate adaptation strategy, which we're required to update every 3 years. And I would say that, one of the most important parts of or elements of our approach to this strategy is to show that we are undertaking really a much more robust approach to an all of government effort. And so I think hopefully you will see, and if you don't, please let us know, but hopefully you will see that, across all agencies, whether it's, the Department of Transportation, Department of Food and Agriculture, the Energy Commission, the Resources Agency, we are all undertaking efforts both within the way that we do sort of our basic day-to-day business, as well as through the work that we're doing through procurement or the funding that we deliver to support action on the ground in communities and regions across California, that climate resilience is a really important element of what we're, how we think about all of that work. So, I'll just give an example at the Resources Agency. We have a group of folks who administer bond and grant funds. And after the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, one of the first things that we did was meet with this group, walk through what are these nature-based solutions and how can we ensure that they really do drive on our climate resilience priorities? What are the state's climate resilience priorities? So, really making sure that folks who are involved in, the significant amount of funding that goes out in our agency are aware of how it connects to our broader climate resilience efforts. I hope that answers it.
Wanda, this next question might be more relevant to Leslie, Corey, and John, but Amanda, definitely welcome your thoughts as well. So great to see examples of regional planning efforts and regional to local planning support. Wanted to see if anyone has examples or guidance regarding regional coordination for grant applications and implementation. Due to the constrained funding environment, we're seeing a lot of competition within our region, and we're interested in finding ways to coordinate with other jurisdictions to bring more resources to our region as a whole. I'm curious to hear if it's a similar challenge that folks are facing. If you have any suggestions or guidance to offer.
Is that to me, Julia?
To anyone. Yeah.
Oh, well, the question might be, what region is anonymous NT? What region is that person in? Because I would think that would matter. I could share some insights if you're thinking with a lot of federal public land stuff, but I'm not so familiar with probably the more urban areas.
I can just quickly say that, that's an intention of ours. And I feel like a lot of my answers are going to be at the outset and not going to be able to show any successes yet or anything, but the county and city, we committed to try to move from assessment to adaptation. What's that going to look like? It's not going to be easy. So we've identified an area which is going to be the hardest hit with sea level rise in the next 12 inches of sea level rise, which is San Rafael, which is our canal neighborhood. Severely disadvantaged neighborhood. People are living 13 to 15 people in an apartment in order to be able to live here because the cost of living is so high. And so we just applied for a Coastal Conservancy grant together, and it was a collaboration where we spent a lot of time, city and county staff, and worked directly with our NGOs. So I would say that for us, it's just starting with that commitment to try to figure it out. And we have a lot of community partners. So in some ways, it's trying to figure out, well, what are the best community partners to work with? Because you can, collaborate to the point where it's hard to get anything done because you've got so many people working on it as well. But so I think we're starting in a little bit, it's regional in a way, in that it's a collaboration between the city and the county and some of our community-based organizations. And yet it also feels like it's doable. It's not too big of a project or anything that would exceed the limits of the collaborative and structural processes we have so far here.
I would just add that it really requires a lot of staff time to make those connections and to take the time to write a grant application and not get that one, but then re-up it for some other grant opportunity that becomes available and change it to meet those requirements, and to continue coordination. So one of the questions that I answered earlier that someone wrote in was how we coordinate, how much time it takes to coordinate, and if it takes a lot of staff time, and it takes a ton of staff time. I mentioned that we meet monthly in our interdepartmental working group. We also meet quarterly with our towns and cities that are part of our multi-jurisdictional Lhmp. So it does take a lot of time. So if you're understaffed, it really makes it difficult.
Thanks, Corey. We have another question here on what opportunities do you see for public-private partnerships to advance local, regional, or state climate resilience goals? I might also kind of add on here, how have you, if at all, involved private sector entities as part of the planning process as stakeholders? Given that this is a webinar focused on planning, but then also in terms of implementation, what opportunities do you see for public-private partnerships?
I mean, I think in the planning, you don't have any choice. I mean, you really want to engage everyone in your community, right? And then the project piece is interesting. I don't have any great wisdom. I will say that we're doing this economic development project as well, where we're trying to understand how climate action can be used to benefit local residents, develop more economic development as well as workforce development in Centerville, and help ladder people up into high-paying or better jobs. And I feel like adaptation work, the projects down the line are maybe a potential opportunity area there as well. And so that's one way that I've been thinking about it, but I don't have a lot of great wisdom. I think it's something that is really worth exploring for sure. I think it's a great question.
And if I could, I think it'd be very helpful to understand Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but the $15 billion, using that number vaguely, I think we've all got a sense that the state is quite passionate about getting those dollars out onto the landscape. But things like OPR staff, grant management, how the funding is going to get out there, I think it's going to be very important to understand what the guidelines are going to look like, what those opportunities will be looking like in the grant guidance themselves. And I think we're all thinking it's maybe 4, 5, 6 months out, but maybe you've got some insights into that.
Well, that $15 billion is not, it's going to be, it's across all state agencies. And so, we coordinate significantly as, climate sort of leaders and coordinators within our agencies to support exactly this, sort of how those grant guidelines are developed. I will say that there's a number of programs that are included in that budget that are just simply re-upping existing programs. So it's not going to be a grant development guideline process per se, that a significant amount of that funding is able to just get plugged into an existing effort.
Good to know, thanks.
And I'll
we have a couple of, please.
I'll put it in the chat. I had one other thought I'll stick in the chat.
Thanks, Wanda. We have a couple of questions for some specific presenters. So this first one for John, does the Eastern Tier Vulnerability Assessment include social vulnerabilities? And how are community members engaged as part of this process, especially given the large geographic area?
It's an excellent question. I will put a link in the chat so you can see the report. It was enormously thorough about all the different population groups and sectors in the entire region. The analysis was quite thorough. We started this project right as COVID hit, and we were planning on doing a lot of community outreach, analog in-person meetings across the region. That was not possible. We're fortunate we have something called Digital 395 over here. We have an enormous amount of broadband capacity. So we were able to move this whole thing over into virtual platforms. And so I'll put some links in the chat to describe the process and how all that was done. It would take me, I could spend a fair amount of time talking about it. I don't want to take the remaining minutes we've got. So thanks for that question. I'll put the things in the chat.
Thanks, John. And that actually made me realize one of the questions that we explored through multiple CAF workshops was the pandemic and how that has been causing challenges in terms of how we've traditionally kind of approached community engagement. We tried to explore some strategies for virtual community engagement or hybrid solutions. Curious to hear if y'all have any examples or advice to offer in terms of organizing inclusive virtual community engagement activities.
I mean, we are very fortunate to have a community partner, the Multicultural Center Marin, that has spent the last 2 years really trying to hone that and learning the interpreter function on Zoom and all that, and trying to do things in a way that can include more people, providing some training. We worked with them and another CBO and some private sector partners to develop a mesh internet system in the canal neighborhood to make sure that more people have access to internet. So I would say that we're in a learning phase around that, but it also was very super instructive for us. We also did we used our community centers as learning hubs and provided Chromebooks to students that didn't have access to the internet at home to try to help young people be able to continue their schooling during the pandemic, which was extremely challenging in our disadvantaged communities. So I think we did this sort of patchwork quilt of trying to support, and we keep in close contact with our CBOs that are working in the communities to try to understand better what the needs are. We have a lot of partnership with the county as well, with county health, and worked to get out there in person to pass out masks, to educate people, to and worked on these social marketing campaigns as well. So there's a lot that happened that I think is really instructive for us going forward. So I don't know if that answers adequately or not, if there's anything follow up with that.
We have just a couple minutes left, so I wanted to kind of just open the floor and see if, Amanda, John, Corey, Leslie, any final words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think it's a very exciting time to be in California for this kind of work. I would encourage everybody to find your jurisdictional walls and find ways to drill, break them down and work across them. This is an effort that obviously transcends everything. So the opportunities are there, and just find those opportunities to do the kind of work that Corey and Leslie have been doing, and reorganize yourselves around the needs.
Well, I support everything that John just said. I guess I would just add, I think in addition to being a good time to be working in this space in California, I would also just flag that we're really grateful for input and recommendations for how our policies and our programs can be adjusted in ways that really facilitate greater action on the ground. So just please, if there are opportunities that you see, I strongly recommend reaching out to myself, to Julia, to folks across the administration to identify those opportunities, because people are looking for any and all ways that we can really support local and regional action on the ground. So that would be my final thought, and thanks again.
All right, we're just a couple minutes away from now officially 1, and I'm committed to getting folks out on time. Just wanted to thank each and every one of you for making the time to join us for this final webinar. Amanda, John, Corey, Leslie, always impressive hearing about the great work that you're doing. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and to all of our participants for joining us for this webinar, and then also the interactive workshop series. It was great to connect with folks and kind of hear all of your ideas. I just want to wrap up to share that folks might have already seen this. This might have come across your inbox. The draft 2021 California Climate Adaptation Strategy has been released for public comment. I believe comments are due mid-November. I won't say the exact date because I can't remember. So encourage folks to take a look and provide comments. Just as Amanda noted, state agencies are excited and waiting to hear from all of you, folks who are doing the work on the ground. So with that, just thanks so much everyone for joining. We'll share the recording and the presentation, as well as all the resources that came from the workshop series as part of follow-up and on the CAF website. So with that, thank you so much. We'll see you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody, that was fun, thank you.